Welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. My name is Michael LeBlanc, and I am your host. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. In this episode, a pickup of an RCC live stream I hosted in November 2024, Doug Norris, Senior Vice President and Chief Demographer with Environics Analytics, and a nationally renowned expert on the Canadian Census and demographic trends with 40 years of experience in social statistics, takes us through the current state of demographics in Canada. Let's listen in now. Well, hello everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from in this great land. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Demographic Insights, presented by Doug Norris, Chief Demographer at Environics Analytics. I'm Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor and host of the Voice of Retail podcast. Today's webinar is generously sponsored by Environics Analytics, Retail Council of Canada, and its members coast to coast. Appreciate their ongoing partnership and support in delivering educational opportunities to our members through both in-person and virtual events like this. So let's get started. Today's webinar, Dr. Doug Norris will examine recent population growth at national, regional levels, discuss international and internal migration data, and how these factors contribute to current population growth and patterns. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Norris. Doug, where are we finding you today?
I'm in Ottawa today, and beautiful temperature, nice temperature for Halloweeners here in Ottawa, and I suspect pretty much across the East Coast. So all good.
Fantastic. My hometown, Ottawa. Were you born and raised in Ottawa, or you live there now?
No, I was actually born and raised in Montreal, but I've lived in Ottawa now for many, many years. So
do you cheer for the Habs or the Senators?
Are you torn? I cheer for the Senators, but boy, I watch a lot of the Habs too.
Right on. You know, in my professional memory, other like right now than AI, I can't recall a topic, issue, opportunity that is more present, more energy, that has more opportunity to Canadians and retailers in Canada than the pretty dramatic changing landscape of our consumer demographics. This is your time, my friend. I'm thrilled to have you here. So why don't I pass the mic over to you? I'll be here, everybody listening in. We'll take some questions at the end. But Doug, without further ado, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you well know, the country's undergone some fairly substantial demographic shifts over the last decade or so, and there's more ahead. And the two big trends that are reshaping our population, both the size of the population as well as the characteristics of the population, are, first of all, international migration, which we hear a lot about these days, and we're going to hear a lot more. And the other that's been happening for many years is the aging of our population. Those are the two big demographic trends. Other things come into play, and those demographics get overlaid with the whole economy. And as a result, that's changing the mix, changing the behavior of consumers out there. So we're going to take you through the history of where we've been over the last little while. We'll look ahead at what we can expect, talk a little bit about the characteristics, and touch on a number of other topics. So the roller coaster here. First of all, for many years, our growth rate was pretty stable. We were growing at about 1% a year, adding 350, 380,000 people to our population. That bumped up a little bit around 2016. COVID hit and it plummeted down for very low growth, and then has really skyrocketed in the last couple of years. And for the last 2 years, we grew by 3% each of the last 2 years. So we've added 6% to our population over a 2-year period. And that's equivalent to the total population of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So clearly a major spike in our growth that, as it turns out, is probably unsustainable, and the government has taken some action to bring those numbers down that we'll talk about. And there are two components which drive growth at the national level. One is what demographers call natural increase. That is the excess of births over deaths. That's no longer much of a factor in growth. Reason being, fertility is low, numbers are actually increasing. We're living longer, but simply because we're an older population, we have more and more deaths. And so that excess of births over deaths, which for many decades really drove our growth, is no longer much of a factor. And what we're left with is international migration. And there are two streams of international migration that are important. One, the more familiar one, is the immigrants that come into Canada with the idea of staying for the long term, permanent residents in name often, or simply immigrants. For many years, we were running in and around 250,000 or so, but you can see how those numbers really doubled in the last 2-3 years. And that's a direct result of government policy targeting a much higher level of immigration. And we'll come back and talk about that. The other stream of international migrants are temporary migrants, non-permanent migrants, mostly students, temporary workers, asylum claimants. And you can see for many years, not a big factor in population growth. Many people came, many people left. It was a bit of a wash. Picked up a little bit around 2015, and that pickup in both the numbers of students and the numbers of workers caused that growth spurt that we saw earlier. But you can see in the last couple of years, that's where the skyrocketing numbers come from. Last year, we brought in 775,000. This is a net number again. Non-permanent residents, add that to the 400,000 net permanent, and we brought in 1.2 million people last year and about the same number the year before. How did this all play out across the country over the last few years? You can see all parts of the country really grew at a pretty good clip. Perhaps the one exception being Newfoundland and Labrador that had a little bit lower growth rate. But a number of the provinces up 2 to 3% growth for the last year. Alberta has been the fastest growing province. Ontario also showing good growth. But right across the board, all of the provinces, except for Newfoundland and Labrador, had pretty good growth. A little bit of a pull down in the growth rate in the Atlantic region, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Now, because of that big spike in non-permanent residents, and you can see at the national level, well over half of the total growth was simply due to that non-permanent resident spike that we saw. Same situation in Ontario and in BC and in Quebec. Non-permanent residents played a major role right across the board, but much more important in those largest provinces. You can see in Alberta, for example, the annual growth rate was 3.3%. 2.1% of that was due to factors other than the non-permanent, 1.2% added on the permanent. And it's important to keep that in mind because, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, things are really going to change in terms of the non-permanent numbers. If we look at how this plays out in the markets across the country, I've actually ranked these areas in terms of their growth rate without the non-permanent. And you can see Calgary, Halifax, Saskatoon, Oshawa, Edmonton, sort of the top five, growing 5, 6, 7%. This is a 2-year growth. If you add in the non-permanent residents, you get a different picture. You can see Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo area, fastest growing CMA, but much of that growth really due to non-permanent residents. Many international students going into a range of educational institutions in the Kitchener area. Also, somewhat similar in the big cities, in Vancouver, in Montreal, most of the growth due to non-permanent residents. So really an important factor that we need to think about when we look at growth rate these days. Also growing, in addition to the large urban areas, are smaller urban areas. High growth out in the Whistler area and Squamish, British Columbia, Canmore near Banff, between Calgary and Banff, Wasaga Beach up north of Toronto, all growing at very, very high rates. What's behind this growth is a combination of people retiring, leaving Toronto, leaving Vancouver, moving to these areas, as well as families moving into these areas. Probably the last couple of years, the ability to work remotely has played somewhat of a role. We don't have exact data on that in some areas. You can see a number of these areas at the bottom really grew very rapidly, but virtually all from non-permanent residents. The extreme case being Cape Breton, when virtually all of its growth, 10% or nearly 10% over the 2-year period, totally due to non-permanent residents, mostly students. So let's drill down and look a little bit on immigration. And the importance of immigration can be seen in this chart, which shows what proportion of our total population are either immigrants, that's the dark part of the bar, and added to that are the children of immigrants or the second generation. And you can see that in the Toronto and Vancouver metropolitan areas, 75-80% of the total population are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Really, really dramatic numbers. You can see nearly half the population of another dozen or so medium-sized urban areas, combination of immigrants or the children of immigrants. And these numbers are probably going to increase further in the future, since most of our growth going forward is going to be due to either immigrants or their children. This just goes back for a minute and looks at the actual total number of immigrants, landed residents coming in, permanent residents coming into the country. I mentioned the 250,000, getting up to close to 500,000. And the first 8 months of this year shows we're on track to come in perhaps a little below 500,000. And as I mentioned, the last 3 years or so have really been a direct result of government policy, which each year the government announces targets for the number of permanent residents. And the targets for the last 3 years have been in and around 500,000 until last week, when the government announced some major changes to these numbers that I'll get to in a minute. Just a point that's important in some ways about permanent residents. We often think of immigrants or permanent residents as arriving fairly recently in the country. But in reality, a more common path to permanent residency in the last few years has been for people to come in as a student, study for 3-4 years, apply for a Canadian work permit, work for a couple of years, get good Canadian experience, and then apply and receive their permanent residency. So some of the new permanent residents have actually been in the country for 5, 6, sometimes more years. And that's different than, they clearly have different characteristics, probably a different consumer behavior than people just arriving in the country. And for the last couple of years, about 40% or so of the new permanent residents, that is people who got their permanent residency, have been in the country for a number of years and were transferring from a temporary status to a permanent status. And we're going to see that likely continue in the future. This shows where the immigrants are settling. No surprise, at the top are the big provinces. You can see Ontario brought in a little over 200,000 of the close to 500,000, a little over 40% of all immigrants coming into Ontario, large numbers into BC, Alberta, and Quebec. But what's interesting is if you relate the number of immigrants to the total population of the province, which I've done on the right-hand side of the screen, I have expressed the immigration numbers per capita or per thousand population. You can see that it's Saskatchewan and PEI that has by far the highest immigration rate, if you will, or per capita immigration at 20 per thousand, or 2% of their population. Immigrants adding 2% to the population of both Saskatchewan and PEI. In the big provinces, many of the immigrants settle there. Their per capita immigration rate around 12 or 13 per thousand, or a little over 1%. You can see the very low rate in Quebec. That's a direct result of Quebec immigration policy. Where are immigrants coming from? This is last year's numbers. I mentioned just under 500,000. Overwhelmingly, the largest number coming in from India. About a third of all immigrants that came into the country last year, and it's been pretty much the same for the last few years, are coming in from India, followed by China, the Philippines. But it's interesting, number of countries on the top 20 list that perhaps aren't traditional countries from which immigrants have come to Canada. You start to see Afghanistan, a bit of a special case these days, but then some African countries, Nigeria, the Cameroons, a little bit further down, Eritrea. And one of the trends that we've noticed over the last decade is a real increasing of the number of immigrants coming in from Africa. Nigeria, the top country, but other countries as well. And today we actually take in more immigrants from Africa than we do from Europe. Philippines was for a number of years the number one country for immigration to Canada. Back in 2015, 50,000 immigrants came in from the Philippines. That's been cut in half last year. And you can see how the numbers have really escalated in India and in some of those African countries that I've also mentioned. So a bit of a shift in terms of the makeup of our immigrant population. While overall, India dominates the numbers coming into Canada, and that's the case for most of the country, except, no surprise, in Quebec, where the Francophone immigration shows up from France, the Cameroons. China shows up as the third country in Quebec. So while India is at the top, once you get below that, you start to see a different mix of immigrants. For example, in the Atlantic region, the Philippines, China, Nigeria, African. If you go out to Saskatchewan, you have India, the Philippines, Nigeria, China, Vietnam. So you get a different profile of immigrants depending on which province or which region of the country. Important to keep in mind if you're looking at new consumers, they're coming from different parts of the world in different regions across the country. Just a couple of quick characteristics of the new immigrants coming into Canada. They're young, much younger than the total population, and as a result, it has an effect of slowing slightly the aging of our population that we'll look at a little bit later. They're highly educated. They have double the level of high education of university degrees compared to the Canadian-born. And their income situation, which lags behind the Canadian-born, certainly for a few years after they arrive in the country, that gap has actually been closing a little bit. And one of the big reasons for that, as I mentioned earlier, a considerable portion of new permanent residents or new immigrants have been in the country for a while, have worked in the country, gained Canadian experience, and are starting off as a permanent resident in a better situation income-wise than their predecessor. Just a quick word on the temporary or non-permanent residents. This shows the number of permits that were approved by the immigration authorities over the last 7 or 8 years, and you can see that big spike in 2023. And this chart breaks out the three types of non-permanent residents: international students on study permits, temporary workers, and asylum claimants. And you can see the increases have been both from international students and from temporary workers. Particularly large spike last year when well over 1 million permits were approved for temporary workers. Not all of those were actually new to Canada. Some of them were people, for example, a student transferring from a study permit to a work permit, but certainly the pattern is pretty much like this for the newcomers. We're tracking the immigrant numbers fairly closely these days by using data from Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. We have data in the form of what we call New to Canada product that allows you to track these data. I'm not going to go into details here, but just to show you an example of how we're tracking data. We don't get data down to a very low geographic level. We get data down to a municipal level, and we model it down to a neighborhood level using relationships from the last census. Just a word on internal migration. Once we get down to regional growth, internal migration comes into play. And there's been some changes on this front as well. This shows the number of people that move from one province to another each of the years over the last couple of decades. And again, you can see a lot of stability in and around 250 to 300,000 people changing provinces each year. Post-COVID, the last couple of years, those numbers kicked up. There were more people moving around. I'm not sure why that was. Part of it may have been a bit of a pent-up demand for moving. People couldn't move during the COVID. You can see the 2021 year a bit lower. Could also be people now moving because they can work remotely, leaving Ontario, going down to the Atlantic region, living there, but working remotely. The numbers came down a little bit last year, 23, 24, and we're going to be watching what happens going forward. So those blip in increase may have been a temporary phenomenon. We'll be back to the more historical, traditional 300,000 level. A couple of big trends in terms of internal migration that are important before we have a look in a little more detail at what's happened. There have been three trends that I've been tracking over the last 5-10 years. One is what happened in Western Canada with the collapse of the resource industry in Alberta. For many years, Alberta used to attract a considerable number of migrants from Ontario, from Eastern Canada. But in 2015, with the collapse of the resource industry, Alberta started to be a net loser of people. That is, more people left Alberta than came to Alberta over about a 5 or 6 year period. But things really rebounded in the last couple of years. And for the last 2 years, Alberta is again booming in terms of the number of people they're attracting, much of them from Ontario and BC. The second trend that probably was somewhat related to what's happened in the West is a turnaround in migration in Atlantic Canada. For many years, Atlantic Canada had been teetering on declining populations. Small decline in 1 year, perhaps a small increase. They weren't attracting too many immigrants and not attracting migrants in any significant numbers from other provinces. That turned around beginning in 2015. Part of the turnaround may be people couldn't go to Alberta anymore, so they went to Atlantic Canada. But in addition, on the immigration side, Atlantic Canada started to attract more immigrants on a per capita basis. And the Atlantic provinces started to grow, both from internal and international migration. And the third big trend that it really impacts on our big urban areas of Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver is a continuing outmigration. These three areas lose population to other parts of the province. They attract many, many immigrants, but that's balanced somewhat and results in a pull down in their overall growth rate. Alberta, as I mentioned, really growing rapidly in the last 2 years, but you can see the Atlantic provinces all growing at a pretty good rate. Newfoundland, Labrador, a little bit lower. And all of the Atlantic region, plus Alberta, were really the only parts of the country that were gaining population to different degrees as a result of interprovincial migration. All of the other provinces were net losers, some of them just small losses, certainly in terms of their population in Quebec and Ontario. Manitoba and Saskatchewan are noteworthy in considerable losses, and that's been happening for well over a decade, but they attract considerable number of immigrants and as a result have been growing. So what's behind the trends differ from region to region. This shows the phenomena I mentioned about movement out of the big cities. You can see here the net internal migration, that is people leaving these CMAs, these are CMAs, for other parts of the country, most of them settling in the same province. And you can see Toronto being the most extreme case. The last 2 years saw about 110,000 people each year leave the Toronto metropolitan area for other, most of them settling still in Ontario, going up to Barrie, to Oshawa, down the 401 to Guelph, Kitchener, London, other medium-sized parts of Ontario, medium-sized urban areas, but also others settling in rural areas, just beyond the fringe, if you will, of the Toronto CMA. Same phenomena in Montreal, people leaving Montreal, a lot of them going up to Laurentians, down to the eastern townships. A little bit of a loss in Vancouver, not nearly as pronounced. but you can see it's been pretty stable and steady for quite a while, but really picked up in the last few years. I'm often asked, where are these people going? In Toronto, no surprise, where do they go? Where housing is a lot more affordable, down to Oshawa or to Hamilton. I mentioned the rural areas, Kitchener, Barrie, etc. Montreal, heavily going into what gets classified as rural Quebec. These are areas not far from the Montreal metropolitan boundaries. Vancouver, people leaving, going down to the Fraser Valley, going out to the Okanagan, etc. So lots of movement. Some of this, retirees moving out to settle in their older ages in different places, but many are also families. As I mentioned, some of it may be remote work driven, but I don't think that's a big factor. In most cases, I think housing costs are what's driving these trends. Just finally, a word on how the international and internal migration mix together. This shows the top 15 or so CMAs in the country. And you can see in 6 of them, we already talked about Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, gaining a lot of immigrants, losing internally, and still gaining overall, but at much lower levels than you might expect given the immigration numbers. Same phenomena in Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and Regina. Other CMAs gaining from both internal and international migration to varying degrees. In most cases, immigration being more important than internal migration. Just a mention, I've talked a fair bit about migration and movement, and certainly from the point of view of population growth, that's really important. But if you look at your consumer base, that movement, both movement into an area and out of the area, causes what I call a population churning effect in an area. These are customers who are leaving an area, who are coming to an area, and there's a lot of churn in the population, which is important, I think, certainly from a marketing point of view. And this just shows what I calculate as a churn rate, and this does not include the non-permanent residents. So this is immigrants and people moving internally. And you can see getting up to 10% of the population in the large urban areas, the medium-sized, and much higher levels, getting up to 20% in some small urban areas. So lots of turnover of consumers. So what's ahead? We've looked at where we've been, where are we headed? Well, the government, as I mentioned, and as you probably have read in the media in the last week announced some major changes in its immigration policy. Most of that has been driven by that big spike in non-permanent residents. And this chart shows the summary of what's happened to the non-permanent resident population. You can see how the numbers increased from over about the last 2 years. We used to have 1.5 million non-permanent residents in the country. We now have 3 million non-permanent residents in the country, making up 7.3% of our total population. The government has announced they want to bring down that number to 5%, a maximum of 5% of our population over the next 3 years. The other announcement last week was somewhat of a surprise to myself, and I think to many economists and others. The government also brought down not only the non-permanent resident numbers, which have been a topic of most of the discussion, but they really also introduced changes to their permanent resident or immigrant numbers. I mentioned earlier, for the next 3 years until last week, the targets were for about 500,000 going forward. The government reduced those targets by 20 to 25%, moving to a little under 400,000 next year, down to 380 and then to 365. So a considerable reduction in permanent residents and a much more major reduction in non-permanent residents. Moving that to that 5% number will mean that somewhere around 500,000 students and temporary workers will have to leave Canada in each of the next 2 years, in 25 and 26. What this is going to mean, according to estimates put out by immigration last week, we're likely to see, or we may see, an actual decline in the size of our population, slight decline for a couple of years as a result of all those permits that aren't renewed, followed by a return to a more moderate growth of around 1%. Now, the impact that this is going to have will vary across the country. We're doing some work now to look at which areas are going to be hit the hardest, but I think it's fair to assume that those areas with a high number of non-permanent residents, the big provinces of Quebec, Ontario, and BC, will be hit the hardest. Places like we saw earlier in Kitchener-Waterloo area and other areas which have really depended on non-permanent growth, as students and others leave those areas, quite possibly a number of those areas will also go into population decline for a few years. So some big changes ahead, and not only due to the non-permanent, but the immigrant numbers will also be coming down. So there's going to be a big impact. I think, as I mentioned, really going to be felt in areas like the GTA, Montreal metro area, Vancouver metro area. Just to touch very quickly on the other big trend that has been gradually reshaping our country, and that's the shift to an older population and a well-educated population. I'm not going to touch on education today, but I will look at the older population. This chart shows one way of looking at the aging of our population, comparing the proportion of our population in what often is called senior years, over the age of 65, to the kids under the age of 15. And you can see how 3, 4, 5 decades ago, we were a country of young families, many more children than seniors. We now have more seniors than children, and that gap is only going to widen over the next decade or two, up to a situation where about 1 in 4 Canadians will be over the age of 65. But one of the things that's important in the growth of that older population, that's where all our growth has been over the last decade or two, that older population, an increasingly important consumer group. And you can see here a comparison, the under 65 population, the first set of bars being the last decade, relatively low growth, a lot of growth in what I often call the young seniors, mid-age seniors, 65 to 74, 75 to 84. But if we go forward, the growth is really shifting to the oldest seniors over the age of 75 and eventually over the age of 85. Clearly, some major implications on our healthcare system that are going to be more dramatic than we've seen in the past. But also implications for many other aspects of the consumer market. These seniors, large numbers of these seniors are consumers. Many of them are fairly well off. I'm not going to go into the wealth held by seniors, but not all seniors certainly are wealthy. Many are struggling, but many are also wealthy, spending now, and the kinds of things they may spend on, certainly health is a big issue. Lots of travel, they have leisure time. You look at making reservations for a river cruise these days, you're looking at a couple of years ahead, mostly booked by seniors. Concern about financial services, not only how they're living out their older years, how is that wealth going to get managed? Where is it going to go when death takes its toll? A lot of spending on luxury goods. Teenagers have finally left home. They're looking at remodeling the home, perhaps moving from one type of home to another, doing renovations, etc. And on the health side, things like home care, caregiving services, home monitoring devices, home delivery, all things which are likely to be important for that older population. So just a word, very often from the marketing point of view, we talk about the generations. And just here is the generations we often talk about, 5 of them, the oldest being what I call pre-boomers, the boomers, Gen X, the millennials, Gen Z. And you can see today, as I think you probably know, the millennials are the largest generation, a little over 9 million people compared to 8 million or 8.4 for boomers. And before long, Gen X will overtake the boomers, and Gen Z will overtake the boomers, and eventually Gen Z will overtake the millennials. Generations are all at different stages from a marketing point of view. Important to look at the characteristics of these different generations. Someone was pointing out to me the other day, often thought of that young millennial generation. The oldest millennial now is hitting 45, still young, but in a very different life stage. So using generations can be very useful for many purposes, but one needs to be careful and not necessarily think of the generations from an age group point of view because they age more year over year. Lots of variation within generations. So some important differences in values and behavior between generations are probably more within generations, and we need to understand that. So that's all of the data. We've gone through a lot of data. As I mentioned, you'll have access to all of the details. But just to summarize the key takeaways from my point of view, international migration is going to be a big story for the next number of years. That big drop in both permanent and non-permanent. Internal migration plays a role in Atlantic Canada, in Alberta. May see a little bit of a pullback in those areas, but my guess is they're going to continue to grow. I think we're going to continue to see a migration from the big cities to smaller urban areas, medium-sized urban areas. We talked about how growth is going to come down. We'll see negative growth for the first time in my recollection in probably the country as a whole and in many of our large cities. And the aging population will continue with the shift moving to the oldest ages. So hopefully that's giving you some insight. All of this really intended to make you think about how that consumer base that you deal with, that you market to, are changing. And they're changing in many different ways that I think are important. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If someone can pass them on to me, I'll
sure. For sure. That's me, Doug. This is fantastic. Hey. What it's like a fire hose of information here. It's fantastic.
Certainly a fire hose.
There's a bunch. I got a bunch of questions. I got about an hour's worth of questions. But the first question.
Go ahead.
The first question from the audience, and it's about what is happening and why the government is making the decisions to decrease immigration. My answer would be a faint hope of re-election. What would your answer be?
I'd second your view. In fact, I am really concerned about what the lower numbers are going to mean for our economic growth and for employment numbers and for shortages in some areas. I mean, the reason the government went to much higher levels of immigration was all about the labor market and what was happening. Now, they certainly overdid it on the non-permanent side. My own view was that we could probably absorb close to 500,000 new immigrants a year as long as we kept our non-permanent numbers down. But I think to show people that they're really serious and doing something, they dropped the immigrant numbers. But we'll have to keep an eye on what this is going to mean for economic growth.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised to see those go back up at some point.
Let me follow up a question on that. And there's a question from the audience that I'll weave in. So, the idea or the notion that I'm hearing now, you've spoken it, that we could have net negative growth in the country. It does assume that we know what's happening with those non-permanent temporary residents. And the government has said, we don't know when people leave.
That's right.
The audience, so that the math is based on all those people who are supposed to leave. Now, on the other side, conversation or question from the audience is, they know of people who are just leaving and going to the U.S. We don't know. Like, how confident are you the data that's coming out of Stats Canada?
Well, I think up until now, I think the data has been probably pretty good. Yes, they can't really measure exactly the numbers leaving the country, and there no doubt are people who overstay and have been here without any formal credentials. I don't think up until now that's been a major issue. Whether it will be going forward or not, when right. 500,000 every year.
Well, we haven't seen those kind of numbers of temporary residents either, temporary permanents. So
exactly,
kind of been a rounding error up until now, right?
Yeah, and so we'll have to keep an eye, and I'm sure StatsCan is quite concerned with what they're doing. But the data just isn't there. There's no formal way. I shouldn't say there's no formal way. There is possibly more cooperation could be given from tracking people who leave the country from the border. I mean, there are records being kept. I don't think they've been used in that way, to my knowledge, but they might be in the future to monitor exactly what's happening.
I mean, if you and I know it, I'm sure the government and the CBSA knows it. So I think they're working on probably a solution for that. Probably as
just the other sort of real interesting factor that come into play is the U.S. election and what will happen there, and whether we'll all of a sudden have a fair number of people wanting to come to Canada now.
I was surprised actually in your charts by the number of Americans that make up the composition of where people are coming from. Actually,
a lot of them come and they leave. Even the permanent residents, some of them get citizenship, go back. A lot of movement back and forth between the U.S. and Canada, but sizable numbers.
Another question from the audience, and please, if you got a question, throw it in the Q&A or the chat, is just about definition. So when we talk about second-generation immigrants, how do we clearly or classify them? Is it one parent is first generation, both parents? Do we get into that kind of fine details, or how?
Yeah, no, that's a relevant question. StatsCan classify second generation as all people who have at least one parent born outside the country. They further divide the second generation into those who have one parent and those who have two parents born outside. But in general, the way I used it today was at least one parent born outside the country.
Doug, when I think of, and I've been doing presentations on this, I mean, demographics is just math. We've seen the demographic aging of the population coming for 30 years, 40 years. I mean, it's no surprise there. Yeah. Clearly, governments around the world, it's not an issue that it resides just here in Canada. I mean, the far extreme, you got Japan, right, which is, kind of the worst case scenario in terms of age and decreasing population. Now, as I think about it, let me lay this model out for you. I think governments, decision makers, have three levers to pull. They can focus on immigration, temporary foreign workers. They can focus on domestic programs to encourage the domestic population, Canadians, to have more children, whether that's free daycare or tax results or whatever. And they can really put capital into technology. I think of like self-checkouts or, these kiosks. You go to a McDonald's, there's nobody taking your order. Of those three levers, it feels like anyone who pulls one lever too hard isn't winning. But as you look across the world, who's doing this right? Who's got that balance kind of right that we can look to and say, hey, maybe there's a balance here that we need to understand?
Well, certainly of the three things you mentioned, I don't think there's really much of an example anywhere in the world of countries that have really increased their fertility rate to any great extent. There have been small cases here and there, small effects, certainly would do no harm and has a lot of other good, some of the methods. In terms of the technology, I think that's very relevant from the point of view of the labor force. A lot of the talk about aging population, older labor force, etc. And there can be some things done on that front. But the easiest thing to work on is certainly the numbers, but they have to be done in an appropriate way. And, we're fortunate in Canada up until recently when we're very favorable towards immigration, even though we had quite high levels of immigration relative to most countries of the world. Unfortunately, one of the byproducts of the recent government, government actions, I'll say, has been to erode a lot of that real strong support. I'm hoping and I believe that that's temporary and a reaction to the sheer numbers. And I don't think we're headed towards being an anti-immigrant country like other places. But I think people feel, and rightly so, that, look, we've got to get that under control to address the housing issues and the healthcare issues and others. So I'm hoping that's the case, and that's not a long-term trend towards being much more anti-immigrant.
Well, it's also the case that historically Canada has a bit of an easier time in controlling immigration. We've got two big oceans in the United States between us and a lot of people who want to move. So,
For sure.
To be fair, Canada's got and you got the Arctic too. But I just picking up on your last comment and weaving in a question from the audience. It's clear when you look at things, and you mentioned it about movements, right? You've got people moving out of Toronto to find better, cheaper places to live. I'm not sure how much remote work comes in and versus just the affordable cost of housing. I mean, Alberta is just doing so well because people say, listen, I can get a house there for $500,000.
Get two houses there for what Toronto gets one.
Right. So, when you think about that, it must be this housing, let's call it a housing crisis or affordability crisis in general. How do you think this tapping the brakes, so to speak, on the demographic influx? I mean, on the one hand, we're worried about a flattening of the number of workers or the number of consumers. But on the other hand, they don't really have great places to live, and it's causing crisis on the other side. Do you see this tapping of the brakes as a way for us to catch our breath? And is this something that you see, or are you more optimistic about housing starts, for example? If I can actually ask a question out of all this.
Well, a couple of things. Certainly, the sheer numbers are going to take a little bit of pressure, probably more off of rents. I think we've already seen rents go down in some of the big cities simply because those students and temporary workers were taking up, putting pressures on rents. So that's going to help a little bit. Not going to be an overnight cure. What the changes would mean for housing prices, a lot more complex. And housing prices, my guess, maybe a little bit slower increase. I'm not sure. And there's a lot of talk, not directly driven by the demographics, but a lot of positive talk, in my opinion, about some of the changes that could be brought about to really encouraging housing starts and making housing more affordable, et cetera. It's going to be a long road. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But I sense we finally woken up and realized we got a problem. And some of the things that have happened, I think, are certainly going to help. How much? We'll have to wait and see.
Last question, and then I'll kind of wrap it up, is, as we've talked about the swings we've had between the COVID era, the post-COVID era, I thought at one point we'd see about, and it kind of sorts out, about 66% of people going back to work at some way, shape, or form, not 5 days a week, but 3 days a week. But some are going back to 5 days a week. How do you guys think about that in terms of population movement? Do you have a forecast, or are you just like the rest of us trying to figure out where this is going to land?
It is a topic we've been very, very interested in trying to track and understand. And some of our new techniques for tracking movement in and out of various parts of the city, we do track overall, say, numbers of people going downtown at certain times of day, certain days a week. And we're working on that very, very, very extensively. And I think it has a lot of implications, certainly. If people are at home, they're not spending in the restaurant downtown. And certainly here in Ottawa, it's a major problem with the public service.
But on the other side, they're doing more e-commerce and sometimes shopping closer to where they live. So it's a real interesting balance for retailers.
Oh, yeah. It's actually a shift. It's not so much they're spending less. It's just that where they're spending
and how
it's changing. So, you're not in the downtown mall. You're in your suburban shopping center.
You're at Bayshore, not the Rideau Center. Just to show my Ottawa roots there. Hey, listen, Doug, this has been fantastic. Thanks for sharing these insights. It's been a real treat to listen, and thanks for everybody who's been listening in.
Thanks. It's been great.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure and check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global E-Commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor, Keynote Speaker. If you want more content or chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.